It began in the ashes of the Great War, a continent broken and bleeding. Europe was restless, humiliated, desperate for order. Two men born from chaos rose from opposite ends of the same continent, both shaped by violence, both consumed by power, both destined to clash in a war that would engulf the world. Adolf Hitler emerged from the trenches of the First World War with a scarred heart and a furious dream. In his mind, Germany's defeat was not a failure of arms, but a betrayal from within. He saw enemies everywhere, communists, Jews, politicians, and promised to restore Germany's pride. His voice, sharp and hypnotic, carried through beer halls and broken cities. By the early 1930s, he had turned rage into a movement and despair into a weapon. In the East, another revolution had already devoured an empire. Joseph Stalin, once a shadow behind Lenin, clawed his way to the top of the Soviet state through deceit and terror. He ruled with cold precision, a man who trusted no one, who saw enemies even in the faces of his friends. Where Hitler's power came from fury, Stalin's came from fear. Both worshipped control. Both believed the world would bow to their will. For a brief, uneasy moment, they needed each other. In 1939, as Europe prepared for another storm, they made a pact that stunned the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, signed in secret between Berlin and Moscow, promised that neither side would attack the other. Behind its polite language hid a darker truth. They planned to divide Eastern Europe like thieves splitting the spoils. A week later, Hitler's armies invaded Poland from the west. 17 days after that, Stalin's Red Army marched in from the east. Poland ceased to exist. The world watched in horror as two totalitarian powers carved a nation in half. In public, they smiled. In private, they plotted. Neither trusted the other for a moment. For nearly 2 years, the pact held. Trains rumbled across the border carrying Soviet grain, oil, and metals to feed Hitler's war machine, while German officers sent Stalin military technology in return. Both men pretended friendship, but in their hearts they were already preparing for war. Hitler despised communism. He saw it as a disease spread by the very people he blamed for Germany's humiliation. To him, Stalin's Soviet Union was not just a rival empire. It was an ideological enemy that had to be destroyed. Stalin, equally paranoid, watched Hitler's every move. He knew Germany's expansion would one day turn eastward, but he hoped the British and French would exhaust Hitler first. By the spring of 1941, the illusion of peace had run its course. Hitler believed the time had come to destroy the Soviet Union once and for all. He called it Operation Barbarossa, a crusade to annihilate Bolshevism and seize the endless lands of the East. His generals warned him of the danger, but Hitler's confidence was absolute. The Red Army, he declared, would crumble in a matter of weeks. At dawn on June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border without warning. The sky filled with the roar of aircraft. Tanks crushed the roads ahead. Stalin's armies were caught completely off guard. For days, the Soviet leader refused to believe what was happening. His trust in Hitler's promises had been a fatal mistake. The invasion was unlike anything the world had seen. Villages burned, cities fell, and millions were captured or killed. Entire Soviet divisions vanished in the first months. Hitler's troops advanced hundreds of miles, capturing Minsk, Smolensk, and eventually reaching the outskirts of Moscow. The German war machine seemed unstoppable, but beneath the snow and smoke, the tide was already turning. Hitler had underestimated the vastness of Russia, the cruelty of its winters, and the resilience of its people. Stalin, recovering from shock, found his moment. He called for total war. Factories moved east, away from the front, working day and night. He ordered his soldiers to defend every inch of ground, no matter the cost. Retreat meant execution. Defeat meant death. As winter closed in, German tanks froze in the snow. Supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers starved and froze. Outside Moscow, the Red Army counterattacked, pushing the invaders back for the first time. Hitler refused to retreat, ordering his troops to fight to the last man. Thousands perished. The myth of German invincibility was broken. Stalin seized on the moment. His propaganda machine thundered with the promise of vengeance. Not one step back, he declared. For every village destroyed, for every comrade killed, the Red Army would repay the Germans in blood. The war had turned from conquest to annihilation. Behind the front lines, both regimes showed their true faces. Hitler's forces carried out mass executions, burning towns and slaughtering civilians. In his vision of racial purity, millions of Jews and Slavs were marked for death. Stalin answered cruelty with cruelty, purges, forced labor, and executions of his own men. Between these two monsters, ordinary people vanished like smoke. By the end of 1942, Hitler aimed for the oil fields of the Caucasus and the symbolic prize of Stalingrad, a city bearing his rival's name. He believed taking it would crush Soviet morale forever. Instead, it became the grave of his ambitions. The Battle of Stalingrad was hell on earth. Street by street, house by house, soldiers fought for every floor, every wall. German bombers turned the city into rubble, yet the Soviets clung to it with inhuman resolve. When winter returned, the trap closed. Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting them off completely. Hitler forbade surrender. He ordered them to fight to the death. For months they starved, freezing and dying amid the ruins. When the end came, the once proud army of Germany surrendered. Over 90,000 soldiers marched into captivity, most never to return. It was the turning point of the war, and Stalin knew it. Hitler raged in his bunker, blaming his generals' fate, even the weather. His dream of conquering the East had collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance. Stalin, sensing destiny on his side, began to push westward, determined to crush the Reich that had betrayed him. Both men had unleashed forces beyond their control. Millions were dead, entire nations reduced to ash, yet neither would stop until the other was destroyed. The world had entered its darkest chapter, and the duel between Hitler and Stalin had only just begun. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad marked more than a German defeat. They marked the turning of the tide. For the first time since the invasion began, Hitler's armies were in retreat, and the myth of his invincibility lay shattered beneath the snow. The city that bore Stalin's name had become the graveyard of the German dream. As spring returned, the Red Army surged forward. Town after town, they reclaimed the scorched earth left behind by the retreating Wehrmacht. The world began to sense a shift. What had once seemed unstoppable was now bleeding, worn and frightened. In Berlin, Hitler raged at maps that no longer obeyed him. In Moscow, Stalin smiled behind his pipe, certain that history had turned to his side. Yet neither man softened. Each grew harder, crueler, more consumed by the war he had unleashed. Hitler believed a miracle could still save him. A new weapon, a sudden collapse of Allied unity, some twist of fate that would restore his destiny. Stalin believed in nothing but endurance. He would grind the Germans down with sheer numbers, with the endless will of his people. For every soldier who fell, 10 more would take his place. In 1943, the Germans tried once more to seize the initiative at Kursk. It was the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. Thousands of armored beasts roaring across open fields, cannons flashing like storms. But the Red Army was ready. Soviet defenses were deep, layered, unbreakable. After weeks of slaughter, the Germans withdrew again, leaving behind a field of twisted steel and burning wrecks. The dream of conquest in the East was gone forever. As the Red Army pushed west, vengeance followed in its wake. Villages that had been destroyed were rebuilt only in name. Fields were littered with bones. Rivers ran dark with ashes. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of loss, showed no mercy. They had seen their families slaughtered, their homes burned, their land defiled. Now they returned the terror twofold. Inside Germany, Hitler's world was collapsing. Bombs rained over his cities, factories lay in ruins, and food was running out. Yet he refused to see reason. He no longer trusted his generals, his ministers, or even his oldest companions. Decisions were made in isolation, in a haze of morphine and delusion. The man who had once commanded nations now ruled from a bunker, trapped by his own madness. Stalin, too, had grown isolated, but his power was absolute. He ruled from his Kremlin office with iron calm, studying every report, every casualty figure. When his generals hesitated, he reminded them that fear was a weapon more powerful than any gun. The Soviet machine moved forward with unstoppable momentum, devouring everything in its path. By 1944, the Red Army had reached the borders of Eastern Europe. Poland, the first victim of their pact, became the battlefield once again. Stalin saw opportunity not only for revenge but for empire. As his troops advanced, he quietly planned a new order for the continent, one where Soviet influence would stretch from the Baltic to the Balkans. Hitler saw only betrayal. He accused his allies of weakness, his people of cowardice, He ordered new offensives that made no sense, sacrificing divisions he no longer had. The more he lost, the tighter he clung to power. His speeches turned desperate, his promises hollow. Even as Allied forces landed in France and Western Europe began to crumble beneath their bombs, he kept his eyes fixed on the east, as if